Hello, and welcome back to the FeaturesTalk podcast, where we are making vehicle technology simple and relevant for everyday drivers. That is all of us on the road, moving from work to home. We are talking about the vehicle technologies that you see now and the ones you don't see.
Mhm.
And so I am your host, Lisa Bailey, and joining me today, as always, is our automotive resident product specialist and my co-host, Luke Versput. Welcome back,
No.
Luke.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's gonna be an interesting time of peeking behind the curtain this time.
Right?
And I mean a lot of our work and our kind of our mission is that, right?
Right.
Kind of taking the often complex world of automotive safety and kind of making sure that the information is very widely known. But
Yeah.
this today is really going to be peeking behind probably the highest tech curtain that we've done so far. Uh,
I agree.
a lot of our coverage has been on the road towards autonomous driving,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and as far and as the tech and the technology involved that leads up to that, the kind of technological stepping stones to get there.
Yeah.
And this right here is going to be a big one. We've
Yeah.
talked a lot about the interaction between the driver and the vehicle,
Hmm.
and even the interaction between people,
That's right.
just even outside the car, like when it comes to the right questions to ask someone when you go to buy a car,
Hmm.
the good interactions that when servicing a car, just even the person to person interaction,
Yeah.
the importance of just talking about this kind of thing amongst friends and family. But this is now going to be almost the opposite of that. How does your vehicle actually communicate with other vehicles
Yep.
and actually the entire just civil structure around you?
Yeah, we've talked about this in previous episodes with expert guests, right, and
Mhm.
with just me and you, Luke, about how cars are communicating when you think about connected cars. And
Yeah.
so, this being our third episode in the mini series, the first two we really introduced the standards. So we're painting this picture of the ecosystem that is supporting driver assistance systems, which I think is so important for us at the driver level to fully understand, so that we can really come on board and adopt these driver assistance systems that obviously have data backing them, that they are improving your driver safety. And so today we are going to go a layer beneath. We are talking about the actual infrastructure. Okay, so we're
Mhm.
talking about the spectrum, the invisible highway that your car's safety systems are driving on. And then we're also going to touch on the industry advocacy that is shaping what automakers are required to do next. And so, the FCC and the Alliance for Automotive Innovation are two organizations that honestly most drivers probably have never thought about or never heard of unless you're in this space.
Mhm.
If you're in the space of policy and in the space of V2X or vehicle technologies and infrastructure, you would know probably about those organizations, but the average person doesn't. And that's why we're talking about it today. These are
Yeah.
the organizations that are building the road that your car's intelligence is already traveling on. And so, like we did with all of our episodes, one and two, we're going to go through some basic terms that will help you all be able to navigate our series episode today. And so, I want to start with a term that we've talked about previously. We had Partha on and we talked about vehicle to everything. So
Mhm.
V2X is what that's called. And it's called really what it is. The vehicle is connecting to everything or communicating to everything around it. So the communication technology, it allows the vehicle to exchange safety data with other vehicles, and not only the other vehicles, but the road infrastructure and networks in real time, which to
Mhm.
me is, something you've seen in the movies, where they can blow it up for you and you can see that at a granular level. But V2X is a communication technology that makes this intelligent communication relationship possible that we've
Yeah.
talked about.
Yeah. This is where it can start to seem more and more science fiction, but and it has been portrayed a lot in science fiction,
Yeah.
and it usually portrayed by someone pulls up like a virtual diagram of a city,
Hmm.
and then like it like the some filter goes over and it becomes like a grid,
Yeah.
and then you see like all these invisible communication pathways happening. Well, that's what this is. And V2X, the X stands for everything. Just to
Hmm.
clarify, because we've talked about V2V, which is vehicle to vehicle, just individual cars communicating as far as what
Right.
their movement data. But yeah, V2X is to everything, expanding on that. And in order for this to happen, there has to be an enormous amount of different communication channels.
Yep.
Um, and the potential problem with that is that you could get um, signals interfering with each other,
Hmm.
or the bandwidth,
Hmm.
one could say. Um, and that basically has to do with the radio frequency at which this different data is transmitted, and that whole big band of different frequencies together is called a spectrum, right?
Right. Right.
If anyone's heard the brand like Spectrum Wireless, that's why they get their name. That
Yeah.
because it's that. And so this spectrum of frequencies are managed by the FCC, which
Hmm.
is the Federal Communications I'm
Commission.
forgetting about Commission. That's right, Federal
Yes.
Communications Commission. Yeah, see, it doesn't get talked about all the time, and
Yes.
so so it's managed by them, and it includes signals for ADAS,
Hmm.
for the ADAS features that we've talked about a bunch before, and the V2X systems, which is where
Right.
that actually communicates with the infrastructure around.
Right.
Now, the FCC is, as name says, Federal Communications Commissions. It's all about managing all these different radio bandwidths and managing spectrum allocation,
Hmm.
who can use which radio bandwidths to avoid conflict, and certifying different pieces of equipment that are used in that process.
Yeah. And to me, that is very important because if you just take it down to the practical level of a regular conversation that you would have with a friend, right? And you're talking about maybe your friend likes cars as much as we like cars. And we're
Mhm.
talking about the technology that we see in cars today. And then we're talking about autonomous vehicles. And it is really a mind stretch to fully wrap your mind around the capabilities of autonomous vehicles, and then to even bring that further to or a little bit back in capabilities to driver assistance systems that we have in cars today, to see that and say, so you're expecting me to believe that cars are just going to be able to move around the road, and like how are there going to be no interruptions? This is how you answer that question. There is
Mhm.
a dedicated bandwidth, and this is the granular information that I think it doesn't get enough light. It's not talked about enough that they are thinking about this whole ecosystem that they're building. And there is a alliance called the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And this is the actual trade association that is representing, surprise, surprise, the major automakers in the United States. Okay. So the automakers are advocating, and they're advocating through the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And they're advocating at the intersection of technology, policy, and safety standards. This is so important to understand at the consumer level. The ones who are expected to engage and interact with these technologies and purchase them with our money, is to know
Mhm.
that there is an alliance together lobbying for dedicated bandwidth to make sure that the driver assistance systems can communicate effectively to the infrastructure. I just think that's so dope. I mean, the average person just doesn't know it. I mean, do you think the average person knows that, Luke?
Well, I had heard about, and I'm
Yes.
maybe more into
Yes.
cars than most people, and I had heard
Yes.
of Alliance for Automotive Innovation, but I didn't know like what the inner workings of it or
Yeah.
anything. And so yeah, these are, like I said, these are things that aren't in the public conscience as much as many other things.
Exactly. And there's also one other term I want to throw out there: intelligent transportation systems. So, ITS. When you hear this, this is the broader ecosystem of the connected infrastructure. So, this is vehicles and communication technology that are designed to improve the road safety and efficiency. So, this is traffic lights communicating with infrastructure, with vehicles. The it's the broader ecosystem that is working together. And so knowing those terms is going to help you be able to navigate the conversation that we're going to get to into right now. Because when you think about ADAS and signals, every ADAS signal, radar, camera data processing, and V2X alerts, they operate within this frequency band that the
Mm-hmm.
FCC has specifically allocated for transportation safety. And so if that allocation, if it gets it wrong or there is an interference that goes unmanaged, the invisible highway that the car is driving on, it develops what I would say potholes, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
FCC is the infrastructure authority for a road that most drivers have never seen. And as a driver, it's super important to understand the dynamic of that. And so when we're talking about, the FCC managing the spectrum that ADAS runs on, we're essentially talking about who owns and basically policies the airspace that your
Yep.
car uses to talk to the world. So if you think about it in a practical level, for a driver that's cruising at 70 miles per hour on an interstate, this invisible web is the difference between a system that works in a vacuum, only seeing one thing,
Mm-hmm.
and one thing is understood, or a system that can see a mile ahead. Okay. And so,
Yeah.
Luke, what I'm thinking is, what does spectrum management actually mean, for individuals in the driver's seat? If we bring
Right.
it down to that practical level.
Exactly. And it's that is, I think, the best way to look at it is
Yeah.
in actual practice. Um, the the technical background of this is obviously invisible to us. We can't see these radio waves passing through
Right.
the air. And so what you mentioned is kind of that on a practical level, where spectrum management or the FCC allocating a certain gigahertz frequency. In this case, they're targeting 5.9 gigahertz
Hmm.
um, as the radio frequency, and they're calling that the safety band.
Hmm.
And the thing with that is it's designed to be a very latency free, or I should say very low latency um, bandwidth.
Hmm.
And so in practical terms, what that can mean is if that spectrum is not managed properly, then that could be it could be a failure of a safety system where
Right.
you would expect a car to autonomously do something, but it doesn't do something. And that could have undesirable consequences, or maybe even potentially worse, the car does something
Right.
that it otherwise shouldn't, or that a purely analog human driver wouldn't have done,
Right.
um, and shouldn't have done. So, as far as being in the driver's seat, when spectrum management should just be an invisible thing that you don't really notice in your day to day,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That's when this kind of technology is working at its best,
Yep.
when it doesn't really call attention to itself.
Yep.
But on our on the road to more autonomous vehicles, it will be getting attention.
Yes.
So, but yeah, that's as far as spectrum management. What that has meant is that the FCC has targeted 5.9 gigahertz as a safety band, and that's going to be what a lot of these V2X systems are utilizing.
Yeah. It's you mentioned that latency, and when you look at the capabilities of V2X, so we're talking about vehicle to everything.
Hmm.
Um, there was When we were doing research for the episode, we found out that the human reaction time is roughly 250 milliseconds.
Oh yeah.
So, that time in between, oh my God, there's an accident that's getting ready to happen, and your body actually moving and doing something about it, 250 milliseconds. But at highway speeds, right? That's 25 feet of travel before you even hit the brake. 25 feet of travel before you even hit the brake. So if you think about it, a V2X protocol that's managed by FCC with a latency as low as 0.25 milliseconds. So we're going from 250 milliseconds to 0.25 milliseconds with V2X technology. That is the result of basically your car can hear a vehicle 3 cars ahead and prepare to respond to something that is happening.
Yeah, it's effectively, the idea is that it's 1,000 times
Yes.
faster. I mean, if even if you just like, you know, do the little math thing that they taught, like
Yeah.
elementary school, of just move the decimal point. It's 1, 2, 3 spaces over. It's like it's 1,000 times faster. And that particular number, the at least the statistical average of humans
Mm-hmm.
is
Mm-hmm.
250 milliseconds. There's obviously deviations depending on, age and
Of course.
many other
Of
factors, but
course.
it is statistically the average is 250 milliseconds, and that for me is actually a number that I've memorized for a long time because I like bringing it up when I mentioned that airbags, in order to be certified on cars in the United States, need to fully deploy in between 25 and 50 milliseconds,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
and so it's strange to think that an airbag could go 10 times
Yes.
in that.
Yes.
So
And even thinking about it at that level, it shows the necessity for the alliance. It shows the necessity for the dedicated band. It shows the necessity at that granular level to just weave that safety through to make sure that, okay, the technology is going to do what it's going to do. And it's also seeing the invisible, right? So we talked about this. NHTSA's FMVSS 127 mandates that your car's local sensors detect a pedestrian in the dark. So those are sensors that are still limited by a line of sight. So that
yeah,
spectrum enabled safety allows the car to receive the data from the road infrastructure. And that would be V2I. So vehicle to infrastructure and other vehicles that Luke, you mentioned V2V earlier.
yeah,
Okay, so this basically means that your ADAS isn't just reacting to what it sees like you would with your eyes. It's reacting essentially to like a digital map of motion that is being provided by the spectrum that the FCC protects.
yeah,
So
and
it's reliability.
yeah, the reliability has to be spot on, and that right there, I
Yeah.
mean, seeing things that are invisible, that's, I mean, a good example of that I've brought up before is that an autonomous, vehicle that is properly utilizing this kind of thing,
Yeah.
would be able to make lane changes,
Mhm.
ahead of time, because it's been told that up ahead there's some kind of obstruction on the road, and so instead of the human driver
Mhm.
not paying attention and then suddenly seeing something on the road and bam, swerving,
Yeah.
then those kinds of things can be communicated ahead of time. And again, it's we always bring this up, that reliability doesn't happen overnight. It does take, you know time to get there. And
Yes.
the more testing and more unique scenarios happens, the more reliable it will get.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm pretty sure Partha spoke about V2X and where we actually see it now. When is this going to happen? And so, full deployment of a V2X ecosystem is still in progress. There's so much that has to happen from the infrastructure level, but there's also the technology as well. So, the infrastructure rollout and the spectrum allocation there has to be coordinated. So there's so many things that have to actually work together in order for us to see this future that we're talking about. But the bridge between where we are and where ADAS can take us runs directly through all of these regulatory bodies that we
Mhm.
talked about today that most drivers have not thought about. And so my suggestion to our listeners too is to take some of these new organizations and new policymakers maybe that you didn't know about and add it to your little Rolodex of what you're going to follow along with when you're looking at cars, or pay attention to what's happening in the industry when it comes to these vehicle technologies, because it really will empower you as a driver to really take control and be confident of the kind of cars that you really are going to see on the roads. That's just, I just think that is so important. It is very, very important. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, they pretty much act as a representative. So they are a unified voice for the automotive industry in the spectrum management ecosystem. So you may not see the automaker specifically talking about this, but you'll see the alliance talking about it, because they have all come to the table and made decisions about it. So their role is to translate high level technical needs into specific frameworks and deployment communities that make these features like V2X possible for drivers. And there's a little tidbit to know about the alliance, is that they made a formal commitment to deploy at least 5 million V2X radios and devices on US roads by 2025, which is last year. So that can kind of give you a timeline as to where we are in moving forward with where V2X is. And this is a massive pledge that helps justify the need for the dedicated safety that we're talking about today. And so, especially on a large scale like that, you know what I mean?
Exactly. And the larger the scale is, the more important it is to, it's like the ultimate example of have all your ducks in a row.
Yes.
Before, because one thing can't roll out before another.
That's right.
It's because if all of a sudden buildings, just buildings and different, things in the sidewalk, but mainly like, buildings are now fitted with all the V2X stuff that they need. To spot accidents, to spot, to warn cars of maybe something happening with pedestrians. But then the cars themselves, the vehicles themselves don't have what they need. Well, then it's kind of goes to nothing. The inverse would be true. If suddenly we had vehicles that had everything they need to be autonomous, but there was no V2X infrastructure supporting them, or if the spectrum allocation and that safety band had not been put in place, it takes all of it at once. And that is kind of the purpose behind the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, is that if every single automaker, if they all were like, kind of all contacting, like saying to the government, we need this, we need this, we need this, it would just be a million things all and none of it would actually be. So it helps to consolidate that. And that's kind of what they do. And this actually is very related to a question that we got from one of our listeners. We have our segment called Listener Lane on the FeaturesTalk podcast, where we actually like to address certain questions that are sent into us by certain viewers. And we had a question come in when we put the word out about this conversation. And our listener asked, who is actually pushing for this V2X infrastructure to happen? Is it the government, the car companies, or someone else, or some combination of that? And that's, like we just mentioned, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, that's the voice of the automakers themselves, of them wanting to further, the safety of their product and further the relevance of their product, as the rising tide of technology is bringing everything up. And it's also combined with NHTSA and the U.S. Department of Transportation, because NHTSA and the DOT, Department of Transportation, they're not really pushing a product necessarily. They're not like a business like selling you, here, come buy our product. But their big thing is maintaining a higher safety standards. And so that's kind of the big thing. It's actually a combination of the automakers and then NHTSA and the DOT.
Yeah. And also the biggest part of answering that question is the data. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Department of Transportation, they are looking at the data. And so if we took a moment to really see how many deaths are happening on our roads in the United States because of collision, because of distracted driving, organizations and policy entities, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Department of Transportation, they have a vested interest in making sure that the public is safe on the roads. And so technology plays a big part in that. And so I also think the driver to V2X and what we're talking about today is the safety that we want to see on our roads as well. So yes, it's NHTSA and the Department of Transportation that's pushing it, and we have the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, but it's also the lives that we're losing on the roads. And that is just a very important part of this whole equation that we talk about every single time we have an episode. One that's coming back to mind right now is when we had Caitlin Magny Miller from Pave on. And she said, we have to bring it back to how many people we're losing on the road, because it is the mom, it is the daughter, it is the brother. That is what we're trying to avoid. And so technology is a very big part of that. And so it's the need for safety that is really pushing V2X. And then these are all of the regulatory bodies and the organizations and the people that have a vested interest in making sure that it actually happens. And so that means that it's for you too, to this listener who's pushing it. You're pushing it because you want to be safe. You want to be safe. You don't know it, but you're pushing it just as much as everybody else is pushing it. I always have a way of like flipping things and giving you a different perspective on it. But I wanted to bring that perspective in because safety is a big part of why we're even here. Safety is a big part of why we are doing these episodes, is that the more you know, the safer you're going to be, the more confident you're going to be in the world and in the way that we're moving towards transportation and mobility. And so the part that most people miss is the state and the local government, the municipalities and the roadside equipment, the manufacturers all have to physically build and deploy the infrastructure that makes a V2X work. And that's what we talked about today. And when any one of those players is missing from the table, the whole system stalls. And so that's what we don't want to happen, right? So while the FCC is managing the spectrum and the Alliance for Automotive Innovation is driving the necessary policy, they are together building an invisible infrastructure that makes collaborative intelligence that Jason talked about in our season kickoff a reality rather than a theory. And so I hope that today's episode helped you see ADAS in a new way. I hope that you learned something new today because we talked about, I know I learned something new from this episode as well. And because I believe a driver who does not understand their ADAS features is far more likely to override them and ignore the critical alerts, or even fail to notice when the calibration issue has compromised their system. Right. So understand the workings of all of this is so important. And so if you haven't tuned in for the first 2 episodes of this mini series, make sure you catch the replay on our YouTube channel. And we will be back, guys, for our final episode that's going to bring this whole mini series together. We're going to be talking about the last mile, where we're bringing it back to the human layer. This is a whole picture that we've been painting. And so share this episode with someone who needs to hear it, who you think it can help. Subscribe to the Features Talk podcast on YouTube and follow us here on LinkedIn as well. And don't forget to drop your questions in the comments. We are always collecting questions for our listener lane segment of the Features Talk podcast. We want to make sure that the content that we're creating is really being valuable to you, that the questions that you really have about this whole ecosystem that we're talking about and some of the sci-fi things that we've talked about, what's really going on, so send your questions in and we definitely listen to you guys. And so until next time, make sure you stay aware, you stay informed, and drive safe. Bye, guys.
See ya.